Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I'm your host, Chris Whitehead, and it's been a longer summer break than I expected. I'm glad to say the conference at Rutgers building today with Tomorrow in mind was an incredible success. We had over 125 attendees and mostly young people, and we built the whole program around trying to educate these young folks and tell them first what these major issues are environmental and developmentally in southern New Jersey and the Philadelphia region, but then also inspire them a little bit and hopefully give them actionable pathways to get involved in these topics. Half the crowd was young people and it went amazingly well. And for it actually kind of impressive. I never had to actually poke anybody to answer a question or ask a question. These young folks were eager to find out more. So that was great to see. And since we last spoke, I had a hard drive also fried, so that was fun. Had to replace computer. Interesting, but as you can tell, I'm back up now. But unfortunately, I wasn't going to bring this up, but I was let go from my job yesterday. And I only would talk about something as personal as that because unfortunately, it's something a lot of other people are also facing right now. I was let go for nothing I did. I'm extremely proud of the work I've done on environmental justice, impacts, and climate policy and risk minimization, and also risk minimization over the last few years. But as I was told, unfortunately, at certain times priorities change. What I want to tell everyone who's also listening today, who might be in a similar spot that I am, is it's not your fault, and also the need for this type of work is not changing, it's not going away. Climate risks are just those risks, and they actually make business and operating a business actually more expensive over time if you don't address them. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, there's going to be work in this space for a long time to come. So please try to keep your chin up. I have no doubt I will still be in this work in some facet or another, and I have no doubt all of you out there will as well if you choose to be. But I'm honored today to be joined by two experts in the field and friends who have been doing this for probably longer than I've been alive, but I don't want to age either of them too much because I'll probably hear about that afterward. But in no particular order, we have Commissioner of the NJDEP, Shawn Latourette, and former Commissioner of the NYSDEC and current partner at F Foley Hoag, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong about that as well. Basil Seggos, fellows, if you can please jump on.
Hey, Chris.
First, I gotta ask, did I get your law firm right?
Yeah, you did. It's Foley Hoag. Yep, you got it.
Okay. Good morning. How are you guys?
Doing
Doing
well.
well. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining. Um, and it's been a very, very busy, unsettling time over the last 8 months or so with all the changes at the federal level. But what I wanted to start off with first was I'm guessing you both were also extremely busy with Climate Week because we're just getting past that. It was actually my first time going into Manhattan, and I happened to actually be there on the day President Trump was also in town. So there's a weird juxtapose of him basically going off on climate and then all the events and passion and interest of the various events around town. So in no particular order, whoever wants to go first, do you want to do a little bit of a post-mortem on your experiences of Climate Week?
Commish, you take it.
Ugh. It was definitely an interesting week. I found myself between uh, New York, New Jersey, Boston, and Philadelphia because the imperative of Climate Week has grown beyond just the organizing and meetings, gatherings that occur on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, which is how this all started in 2009. And I think I expected to come into that multitude of forums with folks disenchanted or frustrated, perhaps a bit less focused on the task at hand, given the changes that we've been encountering here in the United States and elsewhere. And to my surprise and pleasure, folks were undeterred by and large, navigating a different set of circumstances, some more complexities, some points of divergence between the United States and its long-term allies and partners on an international basis. But it was productive in my experience. I've met with a number of folks from around the country and other parts of the world, developed and developing world, and we continue to see folks pushing forward. It's harder in this moment than it has been before. Make no mistake about that. It is harder, and not just for us, but for others as well, and for others in part because of us. But the folks who are engaged in this work are pushing it forward, and there are more hurdles than there should be. But I found folks undeterred, and in some instances, completely focused in a harder way, as though their jobs are more important than they've ever been. So I was hopeful leaving it, tired, tired because it's a lot of running around, but hopeful. I don't know. How about you, Basil?
Yeah, Shawn, I think I'd say the same thing. Unlike you, I didn't really leave Manhattan. I was there for 4 days straight. I checked my step count, 50.2 miles
Oh, wow.
of walking between meetings. That's pretty much the only thing you can do unless you're going north south on the trains.
That's right. Yeah.
It was I echo everything Shawn just said. Surprisingly upbeat and optimistic. I think I was in a range of meetings from local environmental groups, all the way into finance types, legal leaders, in some of the large industrial offices. You think about sort of these national, multinational companies. Everyone wrestling with the same question. Where do we go from here, right? And I certainly expected to come in feeling like possibly there was more of a downbeat view of the future, but I'd say it was the exact opposite. This sort of pause that we're in, this unfortunate pause where we're wrestling with, all of this lost opportunity. People are taking the moment now to retool a little bit and realign priorities and recall where we were back in 2016 when this happened last time, right? When Trump pulled us out of the Paris Accords and all the states then, I was at New York State back at the time, we all got together and determined, we would collectively move ahead together, right? The states and localities would serve as the underpinning for climate action, investment in renewable energy that really set the table for a lot of what happened in the preceding 4 years of the federal administration, right? Giving them that space, that headspace to create positive change at the federal level. We are still in a very admirable position, right? Technology has advanced to the point where solar, wind, storage, all of that is affordable, right, and can be a component of any economy. We have an enormous amount of buy-in, I think, from the public at large. People, want these technologies, want to make these investments. We have rightly retooled our focus to look at environmental justice communities to uplift those who've been left out for many years. All of that is still in place, certainly in New York and New Jersey and beyond. So I think the one thing we don't have right now is the federal government. But I'm like Shawn, optimistic we're going to return to sanity on this because, quite frankly, the demand is there. Climate change is not going away. All of these technologies, all these investment opportunities are still upon us. And I for one think that the market will push us back to sanity before we even have a chance to flip the script on the political level.
And just to follow up on that too, just a thought, especially if you're located or have a business located in certain areas, as an example, a flood zone, it could very well cost you more to wait to act on these issues than if you do now and try to be proactive about it. So I don't know if you guys had the same experience I did, but a lot of the climate events I went to were extremely strong educationally, but I questioned at times, okay, where are the calls to action? Where is the next step after this? What's the it that everyone's going to accomplish after meeting here? Are those collaborations going to happen? I don't know if you guys had a similar thought as well.
Yeah, I think that that is a reflection from convenings like this that is probably not an infrequent reflection. But I think it's important to to ground ourselves in what the forum is intended to do. The forum is intended to sow awareness and be a bridge to build partnerships that either expound on actions that are underway or build the capacities for new actions to come. It has not been my experience in Climate Week convenings that these rooms are the places where commitments are made or expanded, but rather you're sort of sowing the greater atmosphere in which that occurs. So one example would be convening of the U.S. Climate Alliance, right, where Basil's former boss, Governor Kathy Hochul, was chairing the meeting of the governors and state officials that are members of the U.S. Climate Alliance, walking through a number of the initiatives that New York has taken, Delaware, New Jersey, California, Maryland, Wisconsin. There were probably 15 or so states at that particular table, reporting out to each other on where particular initiatives stood and what the next orders of business will be. How we build that relationship doesn't only happen in that room, but in the rooms that follow it. So I think that's an important note on what the forum kind of really stands for in my mind. And I did a variety of different events. One, meeting with young people who are suffering from climate anxiety and creating a forum to just talk through those issues, right?
Great
So
point.
it's any number of types of engagements. Some result in a direct deliverable. Some do not, and aren't intended to. One of the most important places that I find myself, and Basil probably has had this experience as well, is among other subnational actors, because the reality here in the United States, and not unlike the reality in Europe or in South America, is that subnational action on climate mitigation or adaptation is far more productive and reliable and consistently deployed and pursued at the subnational level than it is at the national level. That's always been true of the United States, and it's true of other countries, Brazil, Mexico, so on and so forth. And so I walk away from those conversations, feeling, more positive. Are we going at the scale and at the rate and at the pace that we need to? Absolutely not. Right? No way. No, don't let anybody tell you otherwise. We're not. Right? But we're not. Nobody's sitting on their hands. Right? Or a lot of folks are not sitting on their hands. There are some people who are, in particular, sitting on their hands.
Yeah, look, I mean, look, last time, as I mentioned, we had trouble at the federal level, right? And to the point about subnationals, we found a way forward. And I think what we found is that we're closer to the action subnationally, right? When you talk about states and localities, we're closer to the demand. The federal government often is a bit more removed from that, right? And when you're creating national policies that can be tough to stitch together, certainly over 4-year periods, and that changes from time to time, and we're feeling that now. But we're very durable at the state and local level, and coming out of Climate Week in 2016, it was clear that we had a huge opportunity in New York State to shift the dialogue on this, and that led, of course, to the state's climate law. Took us 3 years to pass, but we got it done in 2019. Which set the stage for a lot of the work that the state's doing now. We also determined we needed to find more money to get things done, right? So you convene at an event like Climate Week, and you realize here you have ambitions, but it's going to take time to pull off, the funding programs you need to develop. And For us, it was, we needed something big and bold. We'd been hit as did New Jersey and Shawn's predecessors by Superstorm Sandy. And you had water flowing into the pit at the World Trade Center, and that was a sort of a paradigm shift moment.
Yeah.
We knew at that point we needed to change the dialogue in New York, and it took us time, but we got a huge bond act done. Voters said yes to it. 70% of voters said yes to the bond act, $4.2 billion in New York State, and that's now being deployed, as is a $5 billion fund for clean water in New York. All of those convenings. When Shawn and I arrive at these events, it's almost like another day at the office in some ways, because we do this all the time and we have hundreds, if not thousands, of staff that are doing this all the time. So for us, it's just, a chance to pull back from our day-to-day action to do the collaborations, the partnership building, the proselytizing and communications, to think about how we can, fertilize other places around the world that are doing this or learn from them. But it's, you leave those convenings as I did this year, and I had a list of 25, 30 people to follow up with, who are doing incredible work. I mean, I'm on the outside and looking in now on government, but so much of what private sector is doing now is underway because of the work that governments have been putting in place over the last few years. So, there's a lot of reason, again, a lot of reason to be optimistic in this really austere moment. Chris, I'm really sorry to hear that you were let go on your job. You are absolutely not alone.
Of course. Yeah.
65,000, 70,000 people in clean energy have lost their jobs already this year. You know, uh, Tens of billions of dollars of economic activity just wiped away.
Yeah.
And yet, to my point in the beginning, the demand is there. We're going to return to it. So folks that have lost their careers or had a hiccup in their careers right now are going to find their way back. And that to me was the big takeaway from Climate Week, that we are not done with this fight. We're very much in the first inning still, and there are going to be generations of people getting involved and making a difference and getting our planet back on track.
Absolutely agree with that. And I actually chose to wear red today, actually, for an announcement as well. I accepted an invite from Rutgers University at Camden to write and do a course on social impacts of industrial development. So
Hmm.
that kind of goes to your point that there's more understanding of this, the import of this now than there was years ago. And the fact that we're going to actually need more people and more young people informed about how all these things interact with each other and how changing something at the top can filter down and have effects below. So it doesn't even actually matter directly if you're going into the environmental space or the exact job you're going to have. Understanding climate change and impacts is going to affect everyone going forward. So I'm excited about that opportunity, and I just want to say thank you for Rutgers for extending that. Um, but that's going off on a little bit of a tangent, so apologies there. I want to go back to something you both addressed, the pendulum swings that happen unfortunately at the federal level and the uncertainty that comes with that. Large scale funders and large scale developers hate uncertainty. So I've been a proponent of the potential for state level policy for a lot of reasons for a long time. But one of them is that it can give developers some measure anyway of certainty that they understand what the playing field is going to be for them going forward. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, as we saw with offshore wind. But can you guys talk a little bit, because you both have extensive experience in this, the process for actually developing comprehensive state policy and what it takes to try to take a big swing?
Basil, why don't you start with I think the climate law in New York is an example of a big swing.
Definitely is.
We don't
Yeah.
have such a law in New Jersey, but happy to offer some corollaries.
Yeah, I mean, going back to before the law was in effect, we had, robust investments in clean energy in New York. I mean, onshore wind, solar, um, transmission upgrades, all of that sort of, clean tech industrial investment was already underway in New York.
Yeah.
But we needed to tie it to something long term. That was the constant theme that we needed to have long-term goals. They had to be more than goals. Of course, enforceable goals are always better. Um, and we needed to, create a sort of a big enough tent uh, in order to hatch something that was workable and doable, and that would be inclusive of all the various sectors that would be regulated. So that was really what we set out to do with creating the state's climate law. And I think, what certainly heard enormous amount of feedback, positive, neutral, negative, in terms of sort of the industrial view of how to do this over time. But by and large, I would echo what you just said. Um, the regulated industries want certainty. They want regulation. They want permanence. And then when they have that, they can go to their funders, they can go to their backers, they can establish long-term plans for investment. And what we've seen, I think what we've seen everywhere when you have the federal government pulling back on certainty, creating arbitrary and capricious making arbitrary capricious decisions on what technology should advance and which ones should not, um, pulling the rug out on congressionally approved funding plans, tax programs. All of that creates this level of uncertainty that leads to all of these job losses that we're seeing right now and the lack of investment that we're seeing right now. So for us at the state level, yes, we have to find ways in which to work with the federal government on matters that have federal jurisdiction. But I think, as probably Shawn will say, there's an enormous amount that is under the control of state governors, right? When you don't have federal jurisdiction, that state governors, governments, legislatures can make proactive investments um, in renewable energy. They can set policies that favor the growth of those technologies across the sector. And you see that in New York. I'm wrestling with it now, even with a few clients who in renewable energy who've have to readjust their physical footprints around federal jurisdictional issues. And yet projects go forward, right? You sort of take the Department of the Interior out of it by designing a smarter footprint of a project. Then you just take out the DOI's intentional posture in controlling a project like that. So, even today, you see shovels going in the ground in New York. We remain one of the top states in community solar. We have a very vibrant onshore wind program. There are some very, headline grabbing offshore wind programs that we have that are still finding a way through. Um,
Actually, just to jump in there, there was actually
yeah,
there was a huge announcement last week as well.
yeah. Big, look, obviously big announcements across the board,
Yeah.
with states fighting back on certain federal decision making. So, we also have permitting control. Like we in New York State, we did fast track permitting for large scale renewables and transmission. So, I mean, that's something that the state fully controls, and that's actually working. It's generating projects across the state. So, we tend to obsess about the federal level. What is the president doing? What should he be doing? What is he not doing? But the burden more often than not falls on the states to either advance or retract. And I'm proud that New York, New Jersey, the collection of U.S. Climate Alliance states are moving forward. And even in states that aren't Climate Alliance states, they're moving forward,
Yeah.
right? I saw a stat on solar starts. Most of them are in Florida and Texas and Midwestern states that are red states. So, that gets to the point that I made earlier. The demand is there, and we, as a nation, are finding our way forward and making the investments we need to make. They're not obviously not fast enough. We're not meeting the moment yet, but we also are not in full retreat.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Shawn?
Yeah, I agree entirely on Basil's point about the ability of state governments to advance climate and environmental reforms broadly construed, right? The reality is that state governments in the U.S. implement more than 90% of even federal environmental laws, and then implement their own state-based laws in their jurisdictions on these topics, like New York does with its climate law, like New Jersey does with the Clean Energy Act or the Offshore Wind Economic Development Act, which are two primary points of legislation on the energy side here in New Jersey. Chris, as you know, I've focused a lot of my time on resilience and adaptation, in part because of these very vulnerable barrier islands, like the one sitting behind me. And part of that ability doesn't come from new law. In fact, comes from older laws that New Jersey enacted many, many years ago, because we have a really long, strong, proud, and bipartisan, and feel a little weird to say that in this particular national moment, but bipartisan history here in New Jersey of always pursuing environmental, public health, and safety protections a cut above where the federal government is or has been, whether it's this one or the prior administration or the several before that, right? And those laws grew up in the 60s and 70s and the 80s here in New Jersey. And so we've been retooling them through regulatory reform to be more future focused as opposed to being focused on legacy issues of the past that are not apt to handle the challenges that we see today, whether it's things like Superstorm Sandy that Basil mentioned or the climate impacts that are to come. And so we've been working really hard on that, have put forward major pieces of regulatory reform, some viewed as controversial, others not, but necessary to ensure our economic development. And it's really forced us to remind everyone that these two forces, economic development, environmental, public health improvement and protection, they're not these mutually exclusive forces that the conventional wisdom might have you believe, but rather they're synergistic, right? Without ensuring climate change, without ensuring resilience to the effects of climate change, you're leaving assets vulnerable, people vulnerable, the environment vulnerable, of course.
Right.
But as a matter of risk management, right? Any large asset owner will tell you it's just downright silliness to not invest in the protection of your assets, whether those are industrial, commercial, municipal, and you see the markets responding to that. Right? We've had multiple credit upgrades, something my boss is very, very proud of, and Governor Murphy is very, very proud of. I think 8 or 9 credit upgrades for the state of New Jersey in the last several years, the most recent of which specifically called out our climate vulnerabilities and our ability to handle them through modulating state policy, right? So the markets take note of these things. Yes, you always get, those who, are sort of, feel as though maybe they're being, forced into a regulatory paradigm they aren't ready for. Unfortunately, the effect that any sort of laggard, the effect is detrimental to any laggards to bringing forward resilience investments and climate mitigation investments, because the market is expecting that of its actors, right? And it's going to continue expecting that, right, on the state and in fact the national level, irrespective of federal retrenchment, right? Because we are already well onto an economic-led transition with respect to climate mitigation and to a lesser degree adaptation, but that is happening as well. And the marketplace is going to keep doing what it's doing. It's going to keep valuing risk. It's going to keep pushing against the aggregation of too much risk, because that's what markets do, right? And so the fact that the federal government is effectively co-signing the the aggregation of greater risks in places that are, particularly in places that are vulnerable already, the market's not going to win, not going to stand for that, right? And so you'll see a tension between federal policy and the market as a result.
Yeah, interesting. And Shawn, what would you say to the argument that over the last few years the DEP has tried to do too many things too fast, too much happening at once?
I think it's sort of funny, that notion of the government doing things too fast
That's true.
and
I
too
think,
many
Shawn, you should
things
move
at
faster.
once,
You should move faster, man.
right? So on the it's you have to actually really think about
I never thought of it
that
that way.
point
It's
of
funny.
feedback, right?
Yeah.
You have on the one hand some folks, and I want to be clear that it is a minority of voices um, that are principally represented by trade organizations and not individual businesses themselves. And that is a really important point,
Yeah.
right? They are selling something to their members, not all of which is being purchased by all of their members. But nonetheless, you have trade organizations on the one hand saying, oh, you're moving too fast, you're doing too much. And on the other hand, telling you that you're too slow and you're not doing enough. It is really fascinating. Um, Look, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can improve uh, our uh, our regulatory environment to both be more efficient, which we are, and to deliver greater degrees of protection for people in vulnerable places, which we are. You can do both of those things at the same time. Um, you know, I think perhaps there are some actors that would prefer that it only be made more efficient and not more protective, I suppose. Um, but again, there's an economic imperative that I think some folks who might criticize adaptation policy in particular, because that's where the majority of the criticism today in New Jersey is at. Um, those who criticize that at the same time, uh, what are they telling their members about preparedness, or what are they telling what are business owners telling their investors? Because investors are looking, so it all sort of doesn't jive actually. Um, and our biggest reform right now, we've been working on since 2020, right? And that reform will be enacted by the end of this year. I don't think 6 years is all that fast, but we're getting there. I think
Um,
what folks are reacting to, Chris, is the reality that change is hard, right? And it's just human to experience change is hard. I don't begrudge that, right? But change we must.
no, I agree with that. And I understand that also the concept, just operationally, that there are costs associated with these changes that have to get factored in, and projects can be expensive. That's just a fact. But a lot of I kind of changing gears now a little bit. A lot of my work focuses on, I think this is something that Shawn alluded to before, the intersection of economic, environmental, and public health impacts, and just the acceptance of the fact that almost every large project that is going to happen in the ground has impacts in each one of those boxes, and they all have to be considered before you go forward. And the fact that historically we haven't been good at this at all as a country, as a state, as a collection of states. So the fact that finally, I'll say finally, the last couple years, I think we're starting to push this more. I understand change being hard for some folks, and I've heard, just as an example here, I meet all my permit requirements, or most of them anyway. I have a 95% compliance rate. I'm not in I'm not in a non-entertainment area. Why do I have to worry about the environmental justice law? Paraphrasing, obviously. Most people on various industrial sites I've talked to are trying to do the best that they possibly can and run their operations the best they can. There's just too many of them in a small area. So, Shawn, I guess start with you again. Um, I've enjoyed or gotten a lot out of the fact that the EJ law in New Jersey has been looked to by so many other states and kind of cherry picked by other states, and now they have their own models. You can talk a little bit about how the process has been for you over the last 5+ years and how that program has been going thus far.
Yeah, appreciate that question, Chris, and your advocacy on the topic and guidance to clients you've had is really impactful, and appreciate that as well. And so, I mean, at its heart, REJ law is intended to acknowledge a pretty simple fact, which is that there are some communities in New Jersey, and in fact, regionally, nationally, all over the world, right, there are some communities that bear a disproportionate burden of the pollution that we all together create. Right? And so, the law is focused on how do we assess that reality, and in the context of building new facilities, expanding existing facilities, renewing permits for existing facilities. How do we bring that into the analysis, right? And it's complicated, but it's not impossible, right? I think there's for a long time folks have labored under the proposition that assessing the cumulative impacts of pollution is a near impossibility, and while causal connections are difficult to make as a legal matter in many respects across all different spaces in the environmental management sphere, it is not difficult to assess the risk of disproportionate outcomes upon a community that is overburdened by pollution. And so it's that work that we've centered ourselves on, right? To avoid worsening disproportionate risk, and to diminish it where it exists, by examining public health and environmental stressors that across 26 different categories, to be particular, so that if you are a facility that is seeking to expand your incineration capacity in an overburdened community, you are able to identify the baseline conditions of that community through data that we collect and make visible, and then evaluate ways that you can avoid, minimize, or mitigate for those particular stressors or your contribution to them. So, I'll give you one, for instance, in a recent case, in a RECRA facility where hazardous materials are loaded and offloaded and recycled, so that we're not just discarding waste oils and into an incinerator, or taking other hazardous materials and putting into a hazardous material landfill. Right? We're in a recycling hazardous recycling facility. One of the best propositions for diminishing fence line emissions was to house certain operations under pressure, so that you weren't getting the fugitives that were emitted from those operations, or could be emitted from those operations. And that is a measure that can be both good for the process, for the industrial actor, right, and good for the community. And by and large, I see our regulated community in New Jersey as wanting to be a good neighbor, or in many instances, being a good neighbor on their own accord. And this point of evaluation gives them an opportunity to engage with their community that they wouldn't otherwise have had, and to demonstrate how they are doing these things, right? Is it hard to move the needle sometimes? Do some folks not want to do more than the bare minimum? Sure. But we've not had a single denial of a facility because of the existence of the EJ law, but we have been able through that process to improve upon the environmental and public health stressors that facility affects, and without enormous cost, right? Because you can do multiple things at one time.
Just to play devil's advocate a little bit, though, the process is taking longer than many expected.
It's taking longer than I would want, and
Sure.
certainly longer than some should expect. But when you have a a novel um, imperative. I mean, there's a lot of effort that goes in on the front end from the regulator's perspective in order to ensure that the system you're building, right, the plane that you're flying for the first time actually works, and that decisions are defensible and reliable by the regulated entities. Um, so yes, it's taken longer. It's gotten faster in the course of this year, which is good. But it definitely has taken longer in the beginning. But it's speeding up at this time, and I think it will continue to do so. I mean, and part of that has to do with the fact that the regulated entities are doing this for the first time
Yeah,
as well.
that's
All
fair.
right. So regulated entities putting together environmental justice impact statements they've never heard of before. Got to tell you, their first cracks, not so great. Right. And so having to spend a little more time with them to get them to the point where like the public can understand what they're saying and not, simply oppose a facility that may seem like it's bad, and to be able to see the improvements that are being made. Right. There is a bit of work of communication that goes into that some facilities just aren't familiar with dealing with. They're like, yeah, we talked to the regulator, we didn't talk to the people. Well, guess what? Now you have to talk to the people too.
Yeah. And I just also a little quick shout out to Dave Pepe, Ken Ratzman, Jillian Alexander. You guys have been great to work with, so thank you for that. Basil, there's a similar model in New York, obviously a little different, and you guys chose to look at more stressors. I want to talk a little bit about how that's been going and what went into the thinking to not just use the same model as New Jersey.
Yeah, I mean, look, we put together a climate law. Central to the passage of the climate law was the objective to uplift all communities, especially those on the front lines, right? Well, we have an obligation as public servants to serve all of our communities and to right the wrongs of the past. I mean, really, what I think we started with when we started talking about the climate law back in 2018 was, um, you know, helping finding a way to correct the egregious errors of the past, redlining all the policies that led to communities effectively being walled off from progress and subject to the worst impacts of pollution, right? So righting the wrongs of the past while at the same time providing answers for the future, like action-oriented answers. So um, acknowledge where we had failed in the past, but provide some optimism that government can be a force for good and can elevate communities. So really, that was a starting point for us. That was what helped us get the climate law passed in New York. And part of that, really important part of it was directing directing the investments out of the climate law into communities. And we set a target of no less than 35%, but 40% ideally as a goal of those investments. So that got our ball rolling, right? We would make the investments in frontline communities. In the process of assembling that law, assembling the regulations behind the law, New Jersey stepped out way ahead of us, and I think, frankly, most other states when it came to exploring the cumulative impacts analysis, and really what Shawn and you and others, so many others had done over the years. I think ultimately will lead to far healthier communities, more regulatory certainty for projects, better innovation, better investment over time. So we took inspiration from New Jersey, our environmental justice community in New York, very outspoken, very, very strong, and is certainly very experienced in this. And while again, I'm not at DEC anymore, so I can't speak to the progress of the regulations, but I think, we want to see where it's worked well, where it hasn't, learn from our neighbors to the west and south, and ultimately, put a similar mechanism in place in the state when it comes to siting and permitting of facilities, and merging that well with the investments that are coming out of the climate law. I mean, that's how it should work, right? You're providing some investments to match up with policies and ultimately some of the work that needs to be done locally to uplift these communities.
Absolutely. And I want to be appreciative of your guys' schedule is here. We're coming up on time a little bit. I always ask a variation of the same final question. The biggest demographic of people who've listened to this program over the last 18 months or so has been actually young people, students attending college, grad school, all various levels. Around that 31, 32% of our audience, and now 72 countries. So again, everyone out there, thank you. I'm grateful. I'm wondering if there's anything you'd want to say directly to them. And also, as an add-on to that, on these topics, what gives you hope going forward, as it's obviously a very uncertain time right now?
Maybe I'll start off and kick it to you, Shawn, for the final word. I'd say two big things. First of all, don't give in to defeatism. Um, Election cycles occasionally bring people that you don't agree with, like. But don't forget that your voice is powerful. Your vote is powerful. Whether you're concerned about climate policy, issues with the rule of law, humanitarian rights, Ukraine, gerrymandering, economic policies that are hurting middle class Americans. I mean, don't just take it, right? Speak up and recognize that your voice is powerful. Whether you're young, middle-aged, older, you have a powerful role in our society and probably in many countries to not just put people in office who adhere to what you believe in, but who can act. And when they're in office, make sure they act, right? I tend to believe that, mayors are closest to the action, right? Mayors have to walk around and see people in the store and they get asked questions about potholes. And they're asked, why aren't you fixing my potholes? Presidents don't have to deal with that. They deal with large policies that take time to implement and often get changed in 4 years. Governors are right there in the middle, right? Where they can create big policies, but they're still close enough to the action. And for people who see their state or their regional leaders, interested in climate action, interested in, rule of law, human rights, hold them to account, keep pressing them. I, for one, would like to see, far more uniform action out of our governors in the U.S. in this moment to push together, to push forward collectively for what matters most to Americans, and that's a clean and healthy environment and an affordable way of life. The second thing is pursuing careers in the environment, in clean energy, in sustainability. If you're considering a career and you're concerned about the headwinds right now that you're seeing at the federal level or elsewhere around the world, the pendulum will swing back. These are still good careers to get into. These are the careers of the future. Whether it's 2 years or 4 years from now, policies will change and the marketplace will be there for you to give you great family sustaining jobs over the long term for many generations to come. Because frankly, we have answers to the crises that are in front of us right now. And that means that we're going to need people to carry out this really important and really ambitious and incredibly inspiring work. What gives me optimism? I think it's just that. It's just that people are so resilient in the worst times of crisis. People find a way to come together. Collectively improve each other's lives. So I've seen that time and again, and I have no reason to believe that this time is going to be any different. Headwinds are headwinds. Eventually, we're going to have the tailwinds behind us, and we'll find a way through.
What he said. The worst thing that we can do in moments like this one where where many folks, and I imagine some of your listeners are sort of experiencing the shell shock of that swinging pendulum. The worst thing that we can do is find ourselves in a place of despair and inaction, right? Because there's always something that you can do in a way that you can be involved in the issue that you care about, right? And by and large, the way to do that is not through obsession with federal policy and national politics, right? In most instances, the best way to do that is in your neighborhood, on the front steps of your neighbors, right? And engaging with the communities that you call home or the places you live, right? Work or learn. The thing that gives me hope is the young people who are listening to this podcast or viewing it somewhere right now, right? Because we have we have a bit of a cyclical problem, we humans, where we kick the can down the road to the next generation and expect them to clean up after our mess, right? Basil and I have spent our careers ensuring that folks clean up after the messes that were made decades ago, and unfortunately, this next generation, right? My own kids, right? Basil's, Chris's, yours as well, right? The are going to be left with problems that they are uniquely suited to solve, right? Because of how industrious, how invested, how passionate the generation Gen Z, Gen Alpha are. And I will tell you, my young kids, one of them, will not stop talking about building recycling robots. Okay, that is the kind of thing that gives me hope, right? That we all leave this place a little better than we found it, right? Is all we could all really ask for. So I'd encourage everybody that's listening to do just that wherever you can.
I absolutely agree with that. And just again to echo a topic that we went over at the Rutgers conference last week, climate anxiety is real, and it's okay to feel a little overwhelmed by this stuff, but there are always actions you can take and ways you can get involved to affect a positive impact by looking at these things objectively. And again, thinking about the economic, social, and environmental impacts of any choice you're about to make. Because if you don't do that, it's going to end up costing you more. Fellas, thank you very much. I enjoyed this. And for everyone listening, stay tuned to the next episode. We're gonna have Pete Malinowski from the Billion Oyster Project and also Mark McDonough from New Jersey American Water. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Chris. Shawn.